Response video to Joe, who I appreciate continuing the conversation. And, sorry about the feds. Looking over my shoulder. I guess they're taking a donut break. Yeah, it's kind of funny, the whole, my videos are being monitored. Ugh. Anyway, yeah, it's good that you're willing to stay in this conversation. Um, it's not a great line. Um, yeah, so I do it again. Anyway, uh, don't say Okay, anyway, don't say anyway. Anyway, all right now then. This whole government creating the money thing. Again, we're still going to keep going back to that because the government doesn't just print money. It just guarantees assets. And there's a big difference between those two things. So you can't just keep saying it's this money system. Um, because this system is just, I mean, yeah, all right, the fractional reserve banking thing. We can just keep going on and on about that. But if they had a reserve limit, instead of letting them go down to 7%, which they went down to, I think, is 7%, which is kind of outrageous, and it was 25%, well, then they could handle catastrophes, where losses were substantial, like in real estate. But regardless, it still goes back to the argument of what would happen, let's say, if the rich didn't finance all those loans. What would they do with their money? They'd have to put their money somewhere. So their money would still go into buying other instruments, all right, other pieces of paper. Um, so I'll make another analogy. Not an analogy. Another story from my past. Okay, so when I was a kid, I was a bit of a capitalist. I mean, I earned money and I basically saved it all, except for buying some pot. That's I saved it. And so there was this time when I was 16, 17 years old. I was like, hell, you got all this money in the bank and I'm getting 2% interest on it, 3% I think it was at the time. And like, back then that really stunk because inflation was like 10% a year. So it's like, oh man, I'm losing money here. Um, so you want to do something with it. So having it in a regular bank account, FDIC insured and all that stuff, kind of stunk. And so you sort of said, well, let's try to find uh, some sort of mechanism that provides more interest. So I ended up buying corporate bonds because I wasn't going to get in the stock market because I knew that was kind of tricky. But bonds were relatively safe. I mean, unless the company goes bankrupt, you're going to get your 7% a year. So it was pretty good. And 7, 8, 9, 10. I think I was getting almost 10% on some of my bonds then. But anyway, so yeah, so I freely chose to get out of the banking system because the banking system couldn't provide enough money. And that's the same thing. Depositors aren't going to use your banking system. They're not going to want anything to do with your banking system because it's not going to be able to produce enough income to the people financing the loans, and the borrowers aren't going to find it too fascinating either because they're going to have to pay a very high premium to make people at all interested in doing the depositing. So interest rates are going to be very high, and it's only through other vehicles, other places are going to be doing all the banking work. And yes, the good news would be is that it's not going to be FDIC insured, so the government will have no liability, and that would be appropriate. Uh, but nothing else is going to change. There's still the wealth equation, and the only banking is not the only place people make huge, preposterous amounts of money. So I think this is where the argument's got to be. I mean, if banking was so rich a business, um, why wouldn't Google go into it with both feet? I mean, they're going into it a little bit. They're creating a electronic payment system, so they're doing the PayPal thing. But those are pretty low margins, pretty tight margins. Why wouldn't they become a full mortgage broker? Why wouldn't they if there was so much money to be made? Why wouldn't they just decide to create a bank? There's nothing preventing them from creating a bank and getting into the banking business if it's so lucrative, if you can make money so easily. And I'm not saying it's not somewhat easy, especially in an economy that keeps growing, but it's not any better than putting your money in the S&P in 1956. You would make a huge amount of money. If you just bought the stock market in 1955, you'd be a really rich man now. And that's just the fact. Because the growth was built into the system, because of the wealth, how much wealth was being generated, especially when we started stealing productivity from all these foreign workers. And the owners all lived here. Well, part of the equation that's the end for us is the fact that now those people are learning how to own themselves. They're not needing the American corporation to facilitate their commerce, and so they're learning how to get into our markets independent of some corporation taking a huge cut and taking a much smaller margin of the profit. And that's part of the, this perfect storm that's been created, this perfect economic storm of all these doomish factors. I mean, you have the peak oil, you have the environmental stuff that's making energy more expensive too. You've gotten decades of, deficit spending, which was really stupid. And then you've got this, the bonus of moving labor to other countries, and we're just paying the whiplash effect for that because there's a consequence to doing that. It's all like so many things. It works over the short term, but it's not sustainable. It won't work over the long term. But you know some of this stuff, so I don't mean to be preaching to you like you don't know that. All right, better finish up quick. The batteries are not too good. So anyway, yeah. So look, the wealth equation is the problem, and people are making tons of money with all this other paper. The money is a really small part of this. Direct interest from borrowed money directly is a small part of this. The whole way capitalism works, the whole way corporations are run, the whole system is working is what's broken, and the fact that all these assets have been turned into income generators. They're not being consumed by people anymore. And we've got to respect work. We've got to pay people to do productive work. We can't be paying people just for owning stuff. And certainly got to tax proportionately to that reality instead of opposite. In our current tax code, basically, workers are taxed more than the loafers, and that doesn't make any sense. The people just sitting on assets, get to keep more of their money than workers, which is just plain crazy. So anyway, there's really, I mean, like we the bank bailout was wrong, the surplus was wrong, the stimulus plan was wrong. There's lots of wrongs of increasing the FDI insurance to $250,000. All these things are wrong, but they're not what created the problem. And fractional reserve banking isn't the core of the problem. The core of the problem is that there's nothing in the capitalist system to regulate the consolidation of wealth, because we allow this inheritance thing to happen. And through that, ownership becomes birthright, and the nobility is created, and the nobility ends up being kings, and that's what we're in. So that's why the system fails. There's no regulator. There's no system that feeds it back in and puts the carrots, the incentive carrots, back in front of the people who should have them in front of them, which are the workers. Yeah, good enough. So, but yeah, appreciate you hanging in there and continuing the conversation. And I know I'm talking a little bit past.